Hi, my name is Chris Larson, and this is my response to the needs and challenges of disasters. After watching the assigned video, I found myself thinking about my own experience with Hurricane Harvey in terms of the disaster phases, especially the heroic phase, um, and the honeymoon phase, and the disillusionment phase. Disasters are often characterized by chaos and uncertainty, and as a result, public health disaster planning and response can present a lot of difficult challenges. Although there are a variety of ways that a disaster can occur, and there's natural disasters, there's man made disasters, things like that. They still follow a rather predictable trajectory of psychological phases. These phases include pre-impact, impact, heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, and recovery. In my reflection video today, I'm going to address the phases of heroic, honeymoon, and disillusionment. The heroic phase is characterized by a high level of activity with a low level of productivity. During the heroic phase, disaster survivors are somewhat energized by the experience. They just survived something huge. Maybe they were rescued, or even were viewing like videos of rescues on the news and taking place just maybe in the neighborhood next to them. They can, survivors during the heroic phase can experience, grief and loss if they lost somebody. But actually, a lot of them can experience feelings such as joy and relief. However, sometimes survivors can also be kind of so focused on that energy that they're in denial of their true needs, and some of them don't fully recognize the true magnitude of the event that they just survived. The needs and challenges of the heroic phase include disaster survivors being in denial of the impact that the disaster had on their homes. During Hurricane Harvey, my cousin's house flooded really, really bad. There was water above the countertop level in their kitchen. They had snakes swimming around in there and everything. When you get rescued from someplace like that and brought to someplace safe and dry, sometimes you use, denial as a coping mechanism to deal with that. So not only can they be in denial of the impact the disaster had on their homes, but they can also be in denial of the disaster's impact on them and their families. Other needs and challenges of the heroic phase include using extraordinary measures to protect their families as well as their homes, and finally, stockpiling community assets. Unfortunately, some survivors expel so much energy in the heroic phase that by the time they reach the honeymoon phase or the disillusionment phase, they're just completely exhausted. Therefore, during the honeymoon phase, some survivors can experience something called a crash point. A crash point can affect any disaster survivor. The honeymoon phase is characterized by a shift in emotion to optimism. This is when the community really comes together and you'll see a lot of media footage. The crash point happens when the heroic phase ends and the honeymoon phase begins, especially when reality starts to set in. Crash points can occur when survivors expel an overwhelming amount of energy during the heroic phase. So by this point, they're just exhausted and completely worn out. Some survivors can also hit a crash point because during the heroic phase, they simply weren't thinking long term and weren't considering how they may be affected in the long term. That this can't go on forever, these heightened feelings and emotions, and really they just overwhelm themselves. The disillusionment phase is characterized by optimism turning to discouragement. As stress continues to take a toll, negative reactions such as physical exhaustion or substance abuse may begin to surface, especially as the larger community kind of returns to business as usual. There can be an increased demand for services as individuals and communities become ready to accept support, realize that they want to seek counseling, things like that. During the disillusionment phase, survivors can experience feelings of fear, anger, and hopelessness. Naturally, this leads to an increase in people seeking counseling. In the video, they talked about how the one lady worked at a place where it was each and every day there was just more and more people seeking help and seeking counseling. Some clinical conditions that can develop from these circumstances include PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Treatments that can help include psychotherapy, psychological first aid, self-help interventions, peer support, and behavioral interventions. Early interventions found to be effective in the treatment of mass trauma include promoting safety, enhancing calming feelings, increasing self and community efficacy, encouraging social connectedness, and fostering a sense of hope and optimism. Collectively, these things have been termed psychological first aid, which serves as a framework for interventions designed to support the well-being of individuals and communities in the aftermath of traumatic events. It's a do no harm approach intended to be easy, simple to implement, and accessible to community members, rather than requiring delivery by healthcare providers, which in the moment can be limited. These principles have a strong consensus as the most effective interventions following psychological trauma, such as a disaster. Disasters have a significant effect on the mental health and psychological well-being of people being exposed to them. Research suggests that the most common disorder after disaster is PTSD, but even more frequently, disasters are associated with the complex comorbidity of co-occurring with disorders such as PTSD with depression, substance abuse, and other anxiety disorders. Research has shown that consistent predictors of adverse outcomes include female gender, socioeconomic disadvantage, high disaster exposure, and low psychosocial resources. Unfortunately, some people get stuck and don't continue to move through the phases. It was very sad to hear about the story in the video of the elderly lady who came in for help after Hurricane Katrina, but to them it seemed like it had just happened to her last week, the way that she was reliving and talking about it as if it had just happened. I personally really enjoyed the discussion about spirituality. I really like the point one of the women said, that God can take these devastating events and transform people's lives for the better so that they not only can survive but thrive. I have included the following resources in my response: an article from the Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction called Resource Mapping During a Natural Disaster, a case study on the 2015 Nepal earthquake by Basu et al., 2017. Post-traumatic stress and depression in the aftermath of environmental disasters, a review of quantitative studies published in 2018 by Lowe et al., 2019. An article called Ecological Disasters and Mental Health, Causes, Consequences, and Interventions by Morgenstein and Rossano, 2020. And finally, a systematic review of the impact of disaster on the mental health of medical responders by Nishad et al., 2019. Thank you.